So this brings us to a particularly enjoyable and festive part of today, which is the essay by the inaugural winner of the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park Essay Award, Amanda Balter. So this year is the first year that the educational program, the Jeffrey Rubinoff educational program run by James, has awarded this essay award prize to an undergraduate writing on the topic of art as a source of knowledge. We've received very many applications, and out of this, those of us who were reading them agreed that Amanda is definitely deserving of the prize. It's a wonderful essay. We're going to structure this talk slightly differently. It's one of the privileges of royalty in the United Kingdom, I think, not to ever be asked any questions. And I think we're extending that privilege to prize winners. Because, you know, especially as an undergraduate giving this talk, I think the wisdom there should not really be questioned. But, but we can, of course, discuss that in the lunch break later on. Instead, we're going to have a few words from Danielle following Amanda's talk. So Amanda Balter is a graduating senior at Rocky Mountain College in Billings, Montana, where she majors in philosophy and religious studies, and in the future she hopes to pursue a graduate study in the liberal arts. So many of you have already met her, and yeah, it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing Amanda and her essay.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Vid, for the introduction, as well as a special thanks to James, Karun, Betty, and the rest of the board for letting me be part of this year's forum and the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park Awards. It's truly an honor to be presented with the inaugural essay prize and to have the opportunity to experience Jeffrey's artwork in person here in beautiful Canada. Today, I will be presenting my essay titled Knowledge in the Presence of Art. Art, through any medium, is an expression of something. That something, unlike a textbook, is not always intended to project direct facts, equations, or statistics. That does not mean, however, that art is not a source of knowledge. Arthur Danto, a modern philosopher and art critic, names an essential characteristic of artworks aboutness. Since the artworks are about something, they must be interpreted. End quote. It is through the process of interpretation that knowledge is built. Knowledge, for the sake of our purposes, is defined as facts, information, and skills acquired through experience or education, the theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. The process of viewing an artwork is an experience in which ideas, information, and action are made available through interpretation. Therefore, art is the source of knowledge because it offers the viewer an experience to see, to interpret, and to make knowledgeable connections. Know thyself. These words that Socrates uttered still encapsulate the human search for self-knowledge that is present within the majority of Western thought. Some of the best teachings are those that provide insight to ourselves that we did not have before. Knowledge of the psyche, the ego, our wants and desires, our tendencies, our thought processes, our prejudices, our bodies, our senses, our minds, etc., are all pieces that Socrates recognizes as possible knowledge gained in the inner quest. Art assists us in the process of introspection through the interpretive experience. To simply view a piece of art is different from interpreting a piece of art. Due to the very nature of art, rarely is the meaning of a piece of art plainly stated. It is within the process of interpretation that meaning, and therefore knowledge, is built. Terry Barrett writes in Interpreting Art, Reflecting, Wondering, and Responding that to interpret art is to understand it in language. However, one must not forget that the language used to make sense of our experience of viewing an artwork and to discuss and to respond to others' experience is up for interpretation as well. Barrett continues saying, to interpret is to see something as representing something, or expressing something, or being about something, or being a response to something, or belonging in a certain tradition, or exhibiting certain formal features, etc. Often it takes more than just vision to see a piece of art as any of those things. We must ask questions about the piece such as, what do the colors, lines, and shapes say? How does this piece make me feel? Why do I feel that way? What is strange about this piece? How do I think that this art was created? What is being symbolized? What do I want to see in this piece versus what am I actually seeing? Does this piece reflect my worldview or a different one? I would argue that how one probes a piece of artwork is even more important than the conclusions that are drawn. Art is polysemic. It can, and most always does, have more than one meaning and more than one translation, and those meanings can be different for each viewer. Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher well known for his hermeneutic theory, recognizes the instability and subjectivity of interpretation and says, quote, "Interpretation signifies that philosophy mourns the loss of absolute knowledge. It is because absolute knowledge is impossible that the conflict of interpretations is insurmountable and inescapable." So, rather looking to art as a source of absolute knowledge or truth, perhaps art's cognitive value lies within the viewer's interpretation of their own emotions, ethics, values, worldviews, and answers to any of the limitless questions stated above. By making meaningful connections between what one sees in a piece of art and how they experience it and what they have seen and experienced in the past, one is able to grow their knowledge of art, knowledge of themselves, knowledge of others, and knowledge of the world. The initial feelings, emotions, or partial thoughts that surface in the presence of an artwork must be made sense of through language, whether spoken or written out or thought out, so the interpretive knowledge or meaning may be shared and affirmed, disconfirmed, discussed, elaborated on, complicated, and challenged either with one's own self or through discourse with others. Beginning as a single viewer, one may process thoughts about the piece of artwork during and after its viewing in order to formulate a cohesive conclusion or conclusions about what one saw, felt, and learned from viewing it. Oftentimes, the answer to those questions are largely self-oriented. For instance, if a painting creates an emotional response because it reminds the viewer of a trauma they have experienced, a close family member that has passed, or a political issue they feel strongly about, then the artwork was the catalyst in the search for self-knowledge. The artwork has spoken to the viewer in a way that urged them to ask reflective questions and make connections with their inner self. One might find art therapeutic in this way, because art, in this transformative process, becomes something like a good listener. More than just a reflective surface like a mirror or a body of water, a piece of art guides you to find pieces of yourself within its masterpiece. So, while a mirror may very well be part of an artwork, such as Vestige by Rob Mulholland or Endless Mirror Room by Yayoi Kusama, their structures redirect the viewer to interpretation versus vain examination. For example, Rob Mulholland's piece represents, quote, "the essence of who we are as individuals in relation to others and our environment," end quote. In other words, this piece is both literally and figuratively reflecting the environment and the relationships that we as occupiers of the land have had with it over the years. The figures outlined in mirrors are reflecting the forest life around them. Not only does this piece push the viewer to ask questions about themselves, their own carbon footprint, their political environmental views, etc., but it sparks a conversation between viewers, building knowledge through discourse. Beyond this, a physical piece of art does not intrinsically have meaning. Meaning, in this case, may be considered a universal truth. The hard sciences, statistics, global warming, these are truths built by language that have been reinforced by fact, theory, etc. A piece of art is presented in a subjective light that requires interpretation. Art is relational in this way. The artist may intend a piece to mean A, B, C, but the viewer may understand something completely different, and that is permissible. The viewer and the artwork meet where they are at. In other words, the viewer walks up to a painting holding baggage of his or her past experiences, education, worldviews, traumas, morals, etc. The painting, holding no intrinsic value or meaning, offers itself as it is to the viewer. Perhaps a beautiful landscape painting, an interactive sculpture, a toilet on top of a stool. Whatever it may be, the viewer cannot set down their baggage. The viewer cannot view the piece of art with any other eyes than their own. Similarly, the artwork cannot be anything other than its physical self. Its characteristics provide general borders of interpretive possibilities. That being said, meaning can be built in the intersecting points of interpretation between the viewer and the artwork. Consider the scenario. Viewer A walks up to a painting in a museum. Viewer A is a 20-year-old Caucasian American female who is a student at a nearby university. She comes across the piece, The Old Plantation by John Rose in 1800. While she is physically viewing the entire painting with her own eyes, she is only seeing parts of the painting. Initially, she feels a sense of sorrow and discomfort. She sees the slaves working on the plantation. She sees the dresses that the women are wearing and the instruments they are playing, although she does not recognize what kind of dresses and instruments they are. She sees the woman's small frame and the simple colors of the landscape surrounding them. She sees the description under the painting and sets the scene in rural South Carolina. She does not see deep African origins or the fact that African dances were oftentimes improvised on the spot. She does not see the mental state of the painter or hear the stories in the painter's head of their ancestors speaking of their experiences with slavery in the Deep South. She has to ask herself questions like, why does this picture make my heart hurt? And why is this picture relatable even though I feel like I have nothing in common with it? In order to begin the process of interpretation. Perhaps she recognizes that she is envious of the woman's small frame because Western media has flooded her with incorrect body images that she sets as the standard for her own frame. Her eyes continues across the painting and she remembers that dress that she wore to prom a few years back. She wonders if her brother, who plays the saxophone, would be able to identify the instruments they are playing. All she sees are drums that look like pots and pans that her mom uses to make supper in the evenings. She realizes she has hardly paid any attention to the landscape and tells herself not to oversee the details. She can feel the movements of the figures dancing, even though she has never read one historical document about the culture of traditional African dance. The emotion that she initially felt in the presence of this painting was processed and understood in language. Language was the tool she used to understand the painting and, at the same time, understand herself. The picture, while it does not depict any words, guided her in language in a way that provided her with this meaning specific to her as an individual with individual experiences. She viewed that painting and, while not gaining universal truth, walked away from that painting with knowledge. Art is a guide in our quest for self-knowledge. It teaches us how to see, not how to view. Art does not force meaning, knowledge, or universal truth down our throats. Rather, it presents itself as a physical piece of creative expression and allows the viewer to interpret what they see through language. Art makes us question our vision and guides us to a place of greater knowledge of ourselves, of others, and of the world we live in, insofar as it makes us think about our emotion, formulate those emotions into words, and then use those words to make sense of what the artwork is presenting. The words that we use will represent the subjective connections that we make and give us a greater understanding of how our past experiences have shaped us to see or not to see certain things in artworks, in ourselves, and in the world as a whole. For instance, if the viewer in the past scenario lived in South America, perhaps her understanding of the African American slave culture that the painting presented would raise different emotions and thus alter the language she used to arrive at a meaning. Presumably, if the viewer was to come back at the same painting 5 years from then, she would most likely see different things than she did at the time because she would have been exposed to different life experiences, possess new knowledge, and therefore make different interpretive connections. Those experiences in between those passing years will consist of everything from friends, family, relationships, births, deaths. Everything that we experience, big or small, shape us. Just like any life experience, art is transactional and relational. It offers us something in return for the experience. The viewer in the scenario above may have left the painting with a new perspective of body image in Western culture, for instance. Perhaps while processing her initial feelings of having a hurt heart, she realized that her insecurities related to her own body image were constructed by Western society because in other cultures, such as the one pictured in the Old Plantation 1800, a small frame was often representative of malnutrition. The knowledge, in this case, that she acquired is identifiable through the change in perspective. Heretofore, the process of interpretation is originally initiated by emotion. Art evokes emotion, and emotion requires interpretation through language. Nelson Goodman says, quote, "The work of art is apprehended through the feelings as well as through the senses. Emotional numbness disables here as definitely, if not as completely, as blindness and deafness. Emotion and aesthetic experience is a means of discerning what properties a work has and expresses," end quote. In other words, the viewer needs to be aware of their emotions while viewing a painting, as they need to be aware of their intellectual opinions and gut instincts. Instead of rejecting the dichotomy between thought and feeling to delineate a specific meaning or universal truth, art recruits emotion within the subjective viewer so they may build their own meaning within the boundaries of the artwork. That being said, emotion must be articulated through language, using the interpretive knowledge or tools that the viewer has gained through life experience, in a way that they can be comprehended by the viewer and possibly shared with others. That said, I would question whether or not we can understand emotion without the use of language. If a piece of art brings tears to your eyes, one would process that response through thought, speech, or writing, and understand that they were moved, upset, hurt, etc. From that point, one must interpret language, in which case we enter the perhaps never-ending hermeneutic circle. However, this process of moving from art to emotion, to language, to thought, to knowledge, encourages the viewer to question their own believed truths along the way. By asking questions about our own prejudices, worldviews, religious ideologies, etc., we are intrinsically questioning our own hermeneutic approaches, our own processes of interpretation. Perhaps that process uncovers a deeper understanding of oneself, society, politics, religious issues, whatever it may be, right away, but perhaps it does not. Maybe one does not initially see anything in a piece of art. Even so, art remains a source of knowledge because it shapes a visual experience, even if one is unaware of it. Likewise, viewing a piece of art influences how one sees things moving forward, because being in the presence of an artwork is an experience nonetheless. Any experience, whether it be a walk in the park, a visit to the local coffee shop, reading a book, or viewing a piece of art, has an effect on an individual. One may view a piece of art and have a more superficial apprehension, but that interpretation is a source of knowledge in the way that it may reinforce the views one already has, challenge them, raise new questions, make one explore different motivations in life, etc. Even if one does not leave a painting with an aha moment, they are still impacted by an experience. Even if someone views a sculpture and they feel angry, but may not be self-aware enough to know why, that experience will still impact the way they see sculptures, society, their friends, the show they're watching on Netflix differently, because they have the knowledge of viewing that sculpture and experiencing the emotions and thoughts that came from it. At that point, they move forward in their lives and interpret new experiences with the knowledge of the visual experience that sculpture provided them with. To counter that, what if the viewer is unaware that the sculpture impacted them in any of those ways? Does that mean the artwork was nothing but a waste of time? An empty pit of useless knowledge? Absolutely not. The process of simply looking is valuable on its own, because being in the presence of an artwork is a sense experience that the viewer did not have before. A piece of art, however, does not have an intrinsic meaning, nor is knowledge just waiting around for us to find it. Knowledge is built. It is acquired through subjective experiences. The knowledge that we build can be supported by facts, statistics, evidence, etc., but it can also be challenged, torn down, or built up by new experiences. Barrett says, quote, "One can accept their worldview and the interpretation that it influences, or reject both the worldview and the interpretation, accept the worldview but disagree with how it was applied with the artwork, or reject the worldview but accept the specific interpretation it yields," end quote. Art is valuable because of its aboutness. Art is not created in a vacuum. It is created in a world containing language, religion, science, etc. It is up to the particular viewer, however, to understand or to make sense of that world through the subjective connections they make with the artwork. Barrett says, quote, "When writing or telling about what we experience in the presence of an artwork, we build meaning. We do not merely report it," end quote. Their interpretation acts as building blocks to whatever knowledge the viewer takes away from the piece. Perhaps knowledge is not built until years later. Perhaps it never comes to fruition for that individual. It does not mean that the artwork was not a source of knowledge for someone somewhere at some time. Moreover, Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German theologian, philosopher, and biblical scholar, and also known as the father of modern hermeneutics, argues that the author, or artist, is the ultimate source of meaning. He says, quote, "Any given piece of text needs to be interpreted in light of the whole text to which it belongs, and both need to be interpreted in light of the broader language in which they are written, their larger historical context, a broader pre-existing genre, the author's whole corpus, and the author's overall psychology," end quote. However, I would agree with Roland Barthes that the author, or in this case the artist, is dead due to the subjective nature of interpretation explained above. Barrett argues, quote, "This principle places the responsibility of interpretation squarely on the shoulders of the viewer, not the artist," end quote. It is irrelevant that the artist intended for the painting to reflect a particular meaning, because the process of interpretation, and thus the construction of knowledge, begins between the viewer and the artwork. The concluded meaning might be much broader than the artist intended. As Ricoeur states, quote, "The text's career escapes the finite horizons of the author," end quote. The same hermeneutic philosophy can be applied with a piece of art in the intentions of the artist. That is not to say the interpretations cannot be inaccurate, however. Quote, "Interpretations are not so much absolutely right, but more or less reasonable, convincing, enlightening, and informative," end quote. In other words, the degrees in which an interpretation builds knowledge, either to persuade, enlighten, or inform the viewer, themselves, or others, can perhaps be used to determine its effectiveness. So, say a viewer brings their dislike of an artist who painted the picture to the canvas. At that point, the viewer is interpreting the artist, not the artwork, and therefore the interaction between the viewer and the piece may not be as fruitful. That is not to say the process of seeing the piece is not in itself valuable. Rather, the viewer must be willing to open their field of view in order for the artwork to offer itself as a source of interpretation for the viewer. That being said, there is no right interpretation, just as there is no ultimate source of knowledge or truth inherently present in the artwork. Art invites us to see for ourselves, to interpret for ourselves, and to make our own thoughts and beliefs, and to ultimately build our own knowledge. The individual freedom that art allows for discussion or for different interpretations, perspectives, understanding, and outlooks creates another channel of knowledgeable growth rather than halting discussion with dogmatic pronouncements. Conversation between viewers or even thoughts with oneself would be limited if art declared one universal meaning. The subjective freedom that art grants gives way for challenging, passionate communication with others about one's own interpretation about an artwork. While art does not deem a right or wrong interpretation, it still provides the parameters for productive conversations and interpretations. One's experience viewing a painting may be completely different than another's, but the artwork is still the artwork. It presents physical characteristics that the viewer must base their interpretations around. Now, a viewer may come to a grander conclusion, perhaps a better understanding of themselves, their experiences, or society in general, but their initial process of interpretation was grounded in the aboutness of the piece of art they viewed. Similarly, if two politicians discuss a controversial sculpture and deem it offensive and have it removed, their original exchange was centered around the artwork. Their interpretations, however, form their own knowledge and in this case ultimately lead to an executive decision about its appropriateness within society. During the process of viewing that piece, experiencing the emotions it brought to the surface, forming those feelings into language, and discussing it with the others, the individual was altered. That interaction with the piece, the language, with themselves, with others, and with society has, even in the most minuscule way, changed the way they will see the next piece of art, talk to the next person in the coffee shop, understand their culture as upholding certain values, etc. Experiencing the artwork has also changed the connections that we make with other pieces of art. Richard Rorty, a contemporary philosopher, says that, quote, "Reading text is a matter of reading them in the light of other texts, people, obsessions, bits of information, or what have you, and then seeing what happens," end quote. In response to Rorty, Barrett writes that when we are, quote, "seeing what happens," end quote, we are making connections between a painting, a dance, or a poem and relevant experiences of books we have read, pictures we have seen, music we have heard, emotions we have felt, and situations we have lived or heard about others. His list goes on. Those connections and conclusions that we make are inevitably part of our hermeneutic process. From that point forward, the experience of viewing the artwork is part of our connective toolbox. That painting, painting, poem, relationship, sculpture is now available to connect with other experiences and are together part of the hermeneutic process that helps us identify with others, make sense of the world, our inner self, etc. One's experience of viewing a piece of art could also help others make knowledgeable connections with their own toolbox. For instance, when telling others our interpretation of an artwork, others are able to disagree, agree, or respond nonetheless to our feelings, thoughts, and ideas about that piece. Barrett recognizes the importance of expressing our interpretations of art with others and says, quote, "Telling is valuable for others as well as for ourselves. In successfully telling our interpretation to another, we enlarge in that person's understanding of the artwork, the world as we know it, and ourselves," end quote. This exchange with other viewers is in itself another source of knowledge that art mediates. As previously stated, art acts as a guide to our thoughts, feelings, conversations, and derived meaning by providing an experience to the viewers. The interpretive process is subjective because that experience may be connected with other experiences that enable one to arrive at one destination and someone else at another. That being said, an experience may never be connected. They may never think about the artwork again, but the viewer still holds the experience as a connective tool capable of shaping their understanding of themselves, the world, other pieces of art, or simply just seeing different creations, designs, art forms, etc. Although an art history major or famous art critic may have the inclination to ask different questions about an artwork than someone with less exposure to art, the process of looking is no less valuable for the latter than the former. Art is a source of knowledge for anyone because it provides an experience just like a novel, poem, relationship, college class, night out with friends, etc. Those engagements shape how we make connections and how we perceive and process the world we live in, and the way we respond to new experiences. Art does not provide a universal truth or definitive meaning. Rather, it provides us the supervised freedom to make connections from our own toolboxes of knowledge. Even if one does not walk away from a painting with a deeper understanding of themselves or a better grasp on the inner workings of society, they are leaving with a visual experience that they did not have before and that will remain with them forever. Lastly, I just want to add that since writing this essay, I've continued my research and have run into a number of other philosophical theories that I believe would shine even further light on how and why art is a source of knowledge, with further examination, of course. Those theories include Plato's theory of form and his understanding of the role of perception and knowing, along with Aristotle's poetics and Augustine's theory of signs. While I won't go into further depth, taken that I've only began to scratch the surface of them, I'm leaving here inspired and encouraged to continue my studies, thanks to the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park's dedication to the arts. What a privilege it has been making new knowledge in the company of such brilliant art minds, in the presence of Jeffrey's art, and in the light of his legacy. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And as I said earlier, we're not going to torture you with questions. But I think I speak on behalf of everyone who was involved in the selection process, how much we enjoyed how in your essay you really brought the experience of art and this, arid philosophical question of art as a source of knowledge in touch with continuous references to everyday experience, be it the coffee shop, be it going out with friends, or being in a particular situation of say 20-something-year-old art major, and reminding us that as viewers engaging with these artworks, we're all coming from our particular situations, and I especially like the sentence when you say the viewer must open their field of view in order to make that knowledge or understanding available from the artwork, and drawing on their own individual toolboxes to make sense of that. And I think something that we all appreciate in this forum is that people are coming from different angles to the work, and that everyone can get something from it. So thank you so much again. And now we're going to get a few words from Danielle Ruderman. So Danielle is the inaugural Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park guest curator. She's graduating this spring, or you've already graduated this spring from Queen's University with the Bachelor of Arts honors, and has spent a few weeks here at the Sculpture Park organizing the exhibition that many of you have seen in the workshop. But if you haven't yet, then please do go and have a look. And so over to you, Danielle.
This is going to be more of an informal talk than many of the other talks that we've heard earlier today and yesterday. Excuse my voice. I've been asked to keep a small journal during my time here. And the ideas within this small talk are going to be a compilation of both the internal ideas and thoughts that have developed into an external path of exploration for myself. During this forum, we've had many interesting discussions about art and spirituality, but I want to take a moment to talk about Jeffrey's work and how this experience has affected my spirituality and worldview. Although I never met Jeff, I've grown to experience an interesting spiritual connection to him, his art, and Hornby Island. In working so intimately with Jeffrey's art commentary, studio space, family, and close friends, I began to understand his mode of spirituality. Each piece of Jeffrey's art was a word in a sentence. It was a word in a sentence to an answer of a question. So in trying to understand his essence, I think I began to view art in the way Jeff did, in that it should be an answer to a spiritual question, inspired by your own mind and driven by an interior space. Jeffrey was inspired by a sense of sacred, the sense of consciousness, and the sense of awe, and used art as a pathway to finding his spirit in the consciousness of the past. When I first arrived here, these ideas truly boggled my mind. I could not figure out how Jeffrey thought this way, and I questioned how he found spirit in art and through counterpoint and all these other ideas that Karun has discussed with you. On the ferry one day, traveling from Hornby back to Courtney Island with Karun, we had a discussion about what it takes to think outside the box. And I think in the existential way Jeffrey always did. And this discussion was the spark that fueled my spiritual journey, both through the art of Jeffrey and in life. After only a very short time here in British Columbia, I know it sounds very existential for the short time, but my perspective on life changed tremendously. As you know, I was invited to Hornby Island to be part of an amazing team and work as the guest curator. However, this experience has developed into something different and something I did not anticipate whatsoever. Jeffrey moved to the island in the late 70s to get away from it all and focus not only on the production of his art, but also the cultivation of his ideas. You see, what allowed him to create sculptures that answered his questions to war, agriculture, and human consciousness was the state of mind Hornby Island puts you in. It is a space of community, while at the same time a space that allows you to be alone with your thoughts, even though many people didn't see him very often. There is a free store where people pick up and drop things off that work for them. That's a quote from a woman who I spoke to. Everyone takes their garbage to the lot, and all the stores are pretty much closed by 6 p.m. People don't have locks on their doors and trust strangers for rides around. I used to think the city was the only place I could be happy because it fueled me with material things everyone in that state of mind, or city mind, thinks they need. It allowed me to consume and raise my status. This is what Karun explained to me that day on the ferry. Jeffrey was, like many people are on the island, free of those imposing ideas. Your brain was then able to focus on a, let's say, company of ideas, a life ethos, or how to better understand life at large. So what I realized was that I had truly never been happier and felt more content than I do here. I realized my brain was so full with cares of my appearance and social status that I wasn't living right. So I thought to myself, what is my role in society? How do I form original ideas about life and what's important within it? Do I just participate as a small part of a big thing, and that big thing being Toronto culture and where I've originated from? Or as a big part of a small thing in Hornby Island? I can consume and be part of this immense consumer culture, or I can contribute to a group of people and their lives directly. I suppose the part that has changed about me the most is my ability to question what makes life full. John McGilvery said to me during the speaker's tour on Monday, "School teaches you some things, but life teaches you much more." And luckily, along with him and many other people, I've met a lot of people on my journey, each teaching me about something new, whether I struggled with the idea or not. And through all this struggle and muddled emotions, I came to the conclusion that Hornby is a place that has truly restored my faith in humanity. The award program that myself, Amanda, and Lika are a part of highly focused on art as a source of knowledge. And after only spending, believe it or not, 2.5 weeks with Jeffrey's art, it is quite clear that his art and the sculpture park have renewed my outlook on spirituality and provided me with just that, pure, awakening knowledge. So I want to take a moment to thank Jeffrey and Betty and their family for giving me this opportunity, as well as the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park board, and for giving me this spiritual awakening. I also need to take a moment to thank some particular people, John Kirk, John McGilvery, and of course, my partner in crime, Karun, for all of their help and encouragement. I'm going to leave you with a quote from one of the Johns. I'll let you figure it out. That I believe, or kind of a statement that I've gathered from quite a few people, that I believe represent the spirituality of the island and Jeff himself. While they were taking the last 2 pieces from Series 9 out to be sited in the back field via a very loud tractor, I'm not going to explain what type it is, but a bald eagle sat on a tree watching them. Eagles typically move when they hear a loud noise. However, this bird remained present. On Monday, there was an odd feather sitting on a mound that Jeffrey and John created for a piece that was never finished during our second tour. And yesterday, an eagle circled around the sculpture garden during one of the speaker's talks. To me, that is the true essence of spirituality and life. And Jeffrey Rubinoff, thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for that really personal and really touching talk. So we're going to sort of round up the discussion with just 15 minutes of kind of open discussion about the talks that we've had over the last 2 weeks. James, do you want to say a few words, or shall we hand over to the speakers, or really anyone can jump in at this point?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Vid, and thank you so much for that talk, Danielle, wherever she's gone. I think that let me just pick up my papers. I do think that one of the things I'm so happy with about establishing the educational program is that it has brought Lika and Amanda and Danielle into our lives. And I think that Jeffrey would be so delighted to have heard that talk and to see and to hear about the huge impact that his art has had on you. So thank you very much for sharing it with us so personally. On the subject of art and knowledge, that is, of course, what the main theme of this conference has been. And I hope that all of you have seen a connection between the different papers. I keep dropping my papers. Because all of the artists that have been discussed over these papers have tried to do more, I think, than to represent the world as they see it. And I think that's the one thing that I see in common between all these different papers. All of these artists think they are more than simply photographic reproducers. What they've tried to do with their art is to disclose or to penetrate deeper meanings and to try to therefore be sources of knowledge, whatever kind of knowledge that is. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and if anyone, and this goes to anyone in the room who would like to reflect on anything, having heard the papers, that they think is interesting, please do take the opportunity to do so now. It doesn't have to be a question. It doesn't have to be a long remark. Anything that has got you thinking, please do contribute. Alan.
I've been struck by the combination of creating work to impart meaning and consciousness and so on, and how that stitches up with the aspiration to change society. And the way in which the artists are tapping into different, religiosities or philosophical perspectives with a faith that their work is going to have that kind of resonance. I don't know about Pierre Bernard and whether he had that kind of ambition. I don't get that sense. But then, the Tate's putting on an entire exhibition of his work, and clearly people respond to it. And as you argue so convincingly, it fits into a larger story in relation to the impact of Bergson. And that, in turn, is an assertion of a metaphysics and a new point of view and a contribution to a different kind of notion of modernity. So in that sense, he's a participant. But I was also struck by the way in which some of these artists are knocking heads with different socio-political situations, like an artist in exile contributing to an Orthodox church in a presentation of religiosity and culture, which also had an important politics to it. Or Kazimir Malevich trying to turn himself into a Marxist and get the black square elevated as the embodiment of the revolution. Or these artists, the Christian Scientists, trying to negotiate World War II, and how they situate themselves in that awful situation in a way that can assert peace and values that are antithetical to that conflict. So, which is to say, I've learned a lot, and have a lot that I'm going to take away and contemplate myself.
Thank you, Alan. Does anyone else have any remarks? It's not mandatory, but we do have a few minutes. Masha.
I'm just going to add to say that there kind of another common denominator or theme that one can talk about is internationalism within this period, because we were talking about quite different geographies, whether this was forced exile or travel, immigration, or ideas, how knowledge and ideas travel. And that's something that is kind of particular interest as well of mine, to think of not only how do works of art travel and their meaning changes through geographical borders, and during historical periods those geographical borders themselves will shift, but the travel of ideas and knowledge, and noting that down, and ideas of historiography, but also kind of certain artists changing narratives and things like that. So, but a commonality of an internationalism during this period, which was concerned with the power of art to shape and, if not change, at least shape society, is something that I think all of our papers spoke to.
Well, one thing that struck me, especially with the talks yesterday, but also the ones today, is the common theme of art and spirituality. And how do we really think of that spirituality? What does that spirituality come down to? And it seems to me that through the papers that we've discussed, some of these artists, and maybe Mondrian's more like that, maybe Bonnard's more like that, maybe Malevich is more like that, sort of see themselves as kind of outside of established orders, be it political orders or be it spiritual orders, right? Whereas others, maybe Steletsky and, as it was news to me, but Hepworth and the artist that Lucy Kent talked about, they very much see themselves as part of an established tradition, going like an old tradition, or indeed a new one, but nevertheless one which is kind of strongly hierarchical and which is kind of an established church or a sect or a new sect or church. So maybe this is something that I'd like to hear a bit more about from the speakers and maybe from the others. Do we see artists' spirituality as something that conforms to our established ideas of spirituality and propagates a vision within that? Or do we see them as mavericks who always stand outside of established orders, and that is perhaps their particular role in that community or in our time?
I'd like to respond to that because I had this wonderful conversation with Anne Breen about just that and trying to get under whether when we talk about art, especially, I was thinking about that when Amanda was giving her remarkable essay presentation about what if an artist agrees with a certain institutionalized spirituality, or the content of which they agree with, and so they have absolutely no problem amplifying it. Why should that be valorized differently than an independent voice? And maybe that's the history of certain strand of Western culture. When it would be very fascinating to me to see if if there are other perceptions of art that fully embrace that institutionalized amplification or repetition of that, or perhaps refinement of feelings. And as Amanda was saying, searching for the words to allow us to better interpret and better experience that art within a certain institutional framework, rather than being those mavericks who then, more in Jeffrey's view, would the artist as navigator and artist as leader that goes beyond the convention to find something new and bring it back. So it would be not so much a question, but it's certainly set up in me that questioning of, okay, is this just part of the Western tradition? Is this just one way of looking at it? And in talking with Anne Breen, and if you have a chance to over dinner, it's certainly interesting getting a different perspective on how that might work.
Just on that subject in a bit of a peripheral way, I think it's worth also mentioning, I've been fortunate to be here 2 years in a row, and one of the sources of knowledge that I enjoyed extensively both years in a row was dinner. So I'd like to thank Betty for her excellent menu choices, which she made clear at dinner she participated in doing. But also, all of the conversations that emerged at the dinner table for me now 2 years in a row have been just as enlightening, I think. I found out, Karun, you have an incredible professional history. Only last night, hearing it, or 2 nights ago. Talking to James is kind of like talking to a BBC personality. I don't know why. And I discovered that James is an almost embarrassingly fetishistic cinephile. And I learned about Masha's travels over the ocean, as well as so many other things that seem to sort of play into knowledge. And so, in terms of thanking people for the forum, all of the people that are involved in making it happen, dinner is great too. And I just want to mention that that's where I also acquired a lot of insight, and perhaps the most spiritual part of the non-intellectualized side of the forum is dinner. So yeah, thanks everybody for
that's why we
conversation.
call it company of ideas. It's ideas, but it's also company.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Nikki, I thought, also wanted to raise a comment, and then Brian.
Well, getting back, I feel like the dinner discussion was so great. I don't want to move back to heavy art history issues. But kind of to draw together what Vid was saying and Karun was saying, and also a point that James raised yesterday, is this issue of modernism. And it's not something we've really talked about, but it's kind of been haunting all of these papers. And going to Karun's point, being these artists being in or outside of the religious and spiritual establishment as well as the artistic establishment. And I thought the papers all did really well to diversify how we think of the arts, particularly in the interwar period. I mean, that was really fascinating how tight these papers are in terms of the decades that they're looking at. Because I think that's a period that has not been addressed well enough by art history to show modernism as a larger umbrella term for a lot of the production and a lot of the thought that was going on at the time. So people like Bonnard and Streletsky, who appear passé potentially in our sort of art history teleology, but were seen as very important figures at that time and were important for different reasons other than whether their work was radical or the latest or not. And then you get Mondrian and Malevich, who are these, big avant-garde figures who, yes, think they're kind of mavericks, as Vid was saying, but we talked about yesterday how there's so many parallels between them through this kind of transnationalism, even though they're coming out of quite different traditions. So yeah, I just really enjoyed it for my own purposes, my own work, to see a conference that talks about modernism in that sense. And I think that's why this theme of art and knowledge, it's new ways of thinking about this time period and interpreting it, that's really quite important.
To kind of echo what you were just saying, Nikki, and also maybe draw on what Danielle was talking about and what I was talking to Karun about yesterday, and how when you're in the city you can be passive, and as you were saying, I entirely footnote you guys over here. But somewhere like on this island, you have to come up with things yourself. Something has to come from you, because it's not the you're not being constantly bombarded by external ideas, so you come up with things internally. And so I was thinking about how, at least for Streletsky and Hepworth and the artists that you were talking about, Lucy, and for Bonnard, they took themselves off outside of the canon, but also geographically were outsiders, whether by being exiles or by going to the countryside, in Bonnard's case, moving to the south, and really isolating himself, I think, quite deliberately. And so this is more of a question, because I would love to know whether this is also true in certain ways of Malevich and Mondrian. I can imagine ways in which it can be true, but I am not the expert.
Just Mondrian kind of living with Hepworth and Nicholson during the war and going to London in that time, there is this kind of back and forth, so that kind of plays into that as well.
Yeah, but so the way they're outside the canon is also geographical. Like, none of them are sort of the centre of Paris. I mean, I'm making an obvious point, really. None of them are in the centre of Paris or kind of in the middle of futurism or something. It's
Streletsky is, but he's living in the attic.
But he's an exile. I mean,
self-isolating,
exiled, isolated in various ways.
But he's in the south of France as well. That's where he's based. So yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting.
Well, I want to assure all of the speakers and the organizers how important this is. Well, I can talk for myself, to me as a student, as somebody who is still developing their sense of professionalism, of the tools of the trade. And the thing that I'm left with about that is such a reassuring thing about the nature of scholarship is that none of the speakers were dealing with people that other scholars hadn't addressed, but each of you provided additional dimensions. That's a reminder that of the nature of the academic conversation. Nobody gets the last word, just the latest word. So thank you for that, because that's what can otherwise be so intimidating as one searches for a topic, as one researches the topic, as one tries to find their way, is to know that, and you've demonstrated that marvelously. Thank you.
Well, I think we will bring the discussion part to an end, but...
Can I just say one last thing?
Yes, sure.
following on
Go
from
ahead.
Brian, thank you so much for the stimulating questions and discussion from all of the students. This conference is also unique in the sense that time was given over to all of you first to ask questions, and you raised so many interesting points that really stimulated us and made us think about our work in a new way and really make it worthwhile coming here, apart from all the fun we're having. So you've given us fresh ideas as well, so thank you so much.
Yes. Yeah, go on.
On behalf of Heather and I think maybe the rest of us, I'm not sure what we're called this year. Are we observers or whatever we're called? Locals or I don't know what. People. You know, this is fascinating as it has been for many years. And I think it's wonderful that you've allowed us, given us the privilege of, some years we participate more than others, but of being here and sharing with us. And I know, like Jeff, whom I usually refer to as the Renaissance man, because he was so knowledgeable in anything. And to share with us over the years his knowledge and to walk with us around the park and explain the ideas and share the sculptures has been just marvelous and given us something to talk about quite often outside this park. And so thank you, Betty, and thanks to Jeff for being so magnanimous in letting us do this and for allowing us to watch the evolution of the park, which is maybe a revolution because it happened pretty fast, I think. And I know James and Betty and Karun and others just done a fabulous job. And also for the Hornby community, this may not get said, for opening it up to everybody and allowing them to share and participate and understand what went on here. So thank you so much, and we hope we're here for many years to come.
Well, me and James have a few thanks to say as well. I mean, I'll be brief and not to repeat the wonderful things that have already been said. So first of all, we'd like to thank our seven wonderful speakers. So Ulrike Vinia, Lucy Kent, Nikola Kozicharov, Lucy Wellen, Masha Mileva, and Amanda Balter, of course, and of course Danielle as well. I think this year we really looked at the first half of the 20th century, many artists who, as we said, existed outside of the kind of centers of modernism, who have dealt with issues of spirituality through the kind of a modern medium, so who provide a kind of a context, even if they don't directly correspond with Jeffrey's ideas or Jeffrey's way of doing things. I think they do provide us with a framework to think about the sculpture here, and equally, I think, listening to these papers within this environment, I think, for me at least, really kind of shed a different light on how I think about these issues. So thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much to our guests from UVic, to the students, as Nicola has put it wonderfully already. I think this conference really stands out from that kind of equality of conversations that we have, because we get to know each other over dinners, because we have this dialogue over the papers. Thank you to Alan Antliff, of course, for bringing them over. I'll hand over to James to have a few thanks from us as well.
Yes, I want to thank on the more logistical side of things. So I want to thank Marty for sitting there dutifully after a very heavy week of festivaling. I want to thank Danielle for, as I said at the beginning yesterday, the extraordinary work she's done here at the park over the last couple of weeks. I want to thank John McGilvray. I mean, I remember when John Kirk next to him was doing the park, I thought, well, it's never going to be as good after John leaves, and it is just as good. It's looking spectacular, and he has worked very hard. They've been extreme. Of course, I must thank Karun. It is a huge logistical task to get people here from all over the world and from all over Hornby, and to organise the accommodation. It takes many months of work, and he never looks frazzled. He never, you're always on hand, and you're always great fun as well. So none of this would happen without you, Karun. So thank you very much. I want to thank Betty, obviously. We should all thank Betty because this, after all, is her home, and she is inviting us all onto her home. We're a demanding bunch. It's a lot of work for her. It's not just Karun who does this. Betty organises everything, all the things with Seabreeze, all of the food, all the wonderful food we enjoy is down to Betty. So thank you very much for having us, Betty. And finally, and I think we should continue doing this for years to come, I want to thank Jeffrey. People say that you can tell a lot about someone from what they spend their money on. And, some people buy fancy cars and some people buy lots of jewelry. And Jeffrey, made this. He made art. He brought people here. He supported the arts. And that tells a huge amount about him. And I'm so grateful that he has brought me here. In the past. I'm so grateful that he continues to bring people here and continues to generate discussion about things that were important to him and should be important to all of us. So thank you to Jeffrey.